Good evening. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the Courtauld this evening. My name is Caroline Levitt. I'm the senior lecturer in art history here and also the current head of the art history department. And obviously the main reason that we're here is to celebrate Nick's wonderful book, which I shall tell you a bit more about in a moment. But let me just begin by welcoming everybody in the audience, really. It's such a pleasure to see some wonderful familiar faces, some faces that aren't yet familiar, but we've got a real distinguished mixed audience this evening. Students that I recognise from the Courtauld, scholars on Gauguin, faculty, friends, family of various members of the panel. So really exciting to see everybody here and a very warm welcome to you this evening. There'll be a chance for everyone to catch up over drinks later and also a chance for you to buy the book if you would like to. And they are taking cards, so you don't need cash. So there's no excuse. The main reason that we're here, of course, is to celebrate Nick. And Nick, let me just introduce you. So Nicholas Thomas first visited Polynesia in 1984 to undertake research in the Marquesas Islands, travelling there notably from Australia. So I think we tend to think of Polynesia as being the other side of the world, but for Nick, not so much. A slightly different perspective, perhaps, from the one that we tend to have in the UK, at least. He was undertaking research for his PhD at the time, and that's something he writes quite interestingly about in the book, actually, that experience of being there as a young white male at that moment. He's since travelled extensively across the Pacific, and he's written on indigenous histories, empire, and art. His books include Islanders, The Pacific in the Age of Empire, 2012, which was awarded the Wolfson History Prize, and Oceania, which he co-curated with Peter Brunt for the Royal Academy of Arts in London and the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris in 2018-19, was acclaimed as a landmark exhibition. Since 2006, he has been Professor of Historical Anthropology, Director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge, and a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. And he brings all of those different rich experiences to bear in the book, which is richly, lavishly illustrated, including some of Nicholas's own photographs. It's in some ways an incredibly personal account, but always a rigorous anthropological and art historical account. He somehow manages to bridge all of those things very effectively, as you will discover if you decide to read it. There are some fascinating moments where he is looking at Gauguin in relation to the indigenous art of the Marquesas, but also in relation to his European forebears and counterparts. And I think a lot of that richness will emerge in discussion this evening. And that discussion is very much enriched by having with us two extremely helpful scholars on Gauguin. Firstly, Elizabeth Childs, who is the Etta and Mark Steinberg Professor in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis. She's an expert on Gauguin. She's authored many essays on the artist. And her book, Vanishing Paradise, Art and Exoticism in Colonial Tahiti, appeared in 2015. And she's been working in recent years with the St. Louis Art Museum on an online presentation of Gauguin's manuscript, L'Esprit Moderne et le Catholicisme. And obviously Gauguin's manuscripts are something that have been very dear to the Courtauld in recent years, since we received two of them, Avant et Après and Raconteur de Rapin. So it's a pleasure to see you again, Liz, having met at workshops over those manuscripts. And Maya Nuku was born in London of English and Maori descent and is curator for the arts of Oceania at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Following doctoral research on 18th century collections of Polynesian art and two postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Cambridge, she's evolved a curatorial approach that centres indigenous Pacific perspectives, grounding the presentation of visual arts from Oceania in the unique conceptual cosmological connections that make art from the region so compelling. And her exhibition, The Shape of Time, Art and Ancestors of Oceania, was shown at the Museum of Art in Pudong, Shanghai, and the National Museum of Qatar in 2023-4. So some really interesting interlocutors here to pose some questions to Nick and get conversation started about this really exceptional book. Nick, I'd like to invite you to speak first. Let's give Nick a round of applause if you can speak.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And I wanted to thank the Courtauld for hosting this event, Liz and Maya for travelling to be here, and you all for coming. I wanted to start by saying why I wrote the book, what led me to write it. I was a student in the early 1980s. At that time, one of the texts many of us read closely was Edward Said's Orientalism, and we were, I guess, an academic generation that got excited by new ways of thinking about colonial representation, colonial art and related issues, and those fields grew and developed through the 80s and 90s, as I'm sure many people here are aware. I did research in the Pacific, as Caroline mentioned, in various places about history, culture, all sorts of issues. I didn't work on Gauguin, but as a friend of mine, a Pacific artist, said that those images follow you around. You can't avoid them. When I saw this painting, Riders on the Beach from 1901, for the first time in Essen, I was sort of stopped in my tracks in a way, because just a few years earlier, I'd been in the Marquesas, I'd been staying with some people in an out-of-the-way valley, and in the mornings I used to walk down to the beach and just sort of chat with people, and very often there were these young men there who were giving their horses a drink in the stream and then getting onto these horses and riding off to gardens up the back of the valley or wherever. And there was something uncanny about this work that just seemed to sort of capture exactly that moment. And it gave me a sense that the thinking that we were all developing about the work of someone like Gauguin in the context of a set of stereotypes around exoticism and so on. There was something else that needed to be said. There was a connection with place and milieu that was hard to reconcile with that kind of sense of a stable colonial culture that was just being dropped on top of all of these places in the Pacific and elsewhere. I didn't take photographs of people getting on horses in the 80s, but I did when I was back on Nukuhiva a year or two ago, and this is the kind of connection that sort of moved me at that point. In 2010, Belinda Thompson curated Gauguin Maker of Myth at Tate, and there was one morning when a few of us who were speaking at a symposium had the chance to walk through the exhibition when it was quiet before all the visitors came in. And I stopped in front of this painting, which I'd seen before, in fact, and was again sort of stopped in my tracks because it suddenly seemed to be completely obvious that the blue and gold fabric is what is called a tifai in French Polynesia, or tivai in the Cook Islands, generally translated as an applique quilt, a textile of sort of missionary, obliquely of missionary origin, but in fact more than a quilt, not an ordinary bed covering, something very much associated with status and rank and ceremony, as it is in this photograph of Queen Marau in her later life, after many years after the death of the last king, Pomare V, to whom she was married. Those tifai are still very much part of life and customary life and ceremony and transactions around, for example, marriage and the birth of children in French Polynesia today. I was also struck by Gauguin's engagement with the modern, what was then the modern dress of the period, not only in well-known paintings, but almost obsessively in his field sketches and in other sources. And all of these expressions of colonial modernity, signs of place and identity that were of the moment, seemed somewhat discrepant with a kind of dominant story about Gauguin as an artist of exoticism. There was an exhibition at the time, The Artist of Myth and Dream, I think in Rome. He was also interested in a kind of hybrid form of choral singing. This is Te Whare Himene. Himene is a loan word derived from English hymns. The hymns are partly church songs, but they're also secular songs. Much of these kinds of cultural expressions of modern Polynesia in the late 19th century are very much alive today. And so I had at one point a little essay about the Te Whaiwhai and Manau Tupapau that sort of rested in a metaphorical drawer for about a decade before I sort of got a sense that actually this needed a kind of bigger sort of exploration, and an exploration that went back into Gauguin's earlier work, because of course in a sense it's no surprise that he should be interested in people's dresses. He had painted dresses in Martinique and Brittany and virtually every other place he'd been. Fabric loomed large. And this is of course a minor painting, but he has a lot of paintings of landscapes that feature colonial bungalows. And in a way, these are very much like counterparts to Paris paintings, like views of Vaugirard or views of Rouen, townscapes, essentially. And I guess I can understand why the museum in Rome didn't call the exhibition Artist of Myth and Dream and Colonial Bungalows. But in a sense, that would be more apt as a sort of story about what Gauguin was trying to get to grips with. I mean, one can't sort of circle around this whole area without acknowledging that Gauguin's sexual relationships and his persona as a male colonist have not become enormously controversial and very frequently cited, indeed a sort of defining aspect of who he is and how we represent and negotiate with him. And I really just want to say two things about that. And one of them is that it takes, I think we have a responsibility to engage in kind of careful historical work that addresses the status and autonomy of young women in Polynesia in that period. And there are arguments which it would take much longer to talk about than I can now, that we're talking about relationships that he had with women who were in effect young adults in that context, and of course that makes a difference. Otherwise, we're in a sense recapitulating all the issues which, for example, Gayatri Spivak wanted to challenge in an essay 40 years ago, Can the Subaltern Speak? The second point I want to make about that set of issues is that over a century ago, in a way that one of the most influential accounts of Gauguin was published, albeit a fiction, Somerset Maugham's The Moon and Sixpence. And Maugham's line is basically that Gauguin is his character Strickland, who is very clearly Gauguin, is a sort of diseased abuser who happens to be also a painter of great and mysterious works. And this sort of little package about what Gauguin is has been extraordinarily enduring. I mean, I'm not saying that idea started with Maugham, but he did package it in a very specific way, and it is still around now. And that raises in a question of what is, in a sense, the sort of necessity of understanding Gauguin in that way. Why does that characterization of him sort of stick when there are any number of other artists or writers or prominent figures who might have been abusive, might have had syphilis, did have syphilis, etc., etc. And I think part of it is that Gauguin's works are very familiar, so in a sense we know them just as well as we know Van Gogh's sunflowers. But many of them are actually also incredibly difficult to understand. I mean, you look at these works and you think, what the hell is actually going on here? And why do we encounter this combination of motifs? Where are these people going? Where do they come from? And I have a sense that, in a way, the appeal of the Morm formula that endures in certain forms in critical post-colonial accounts of Gauguin is that it gives us a handle on him that is otherwise incredibly difficult to find. He is contradictory, the work is enigmatic in multiple senses. But I also think it's rewarding and that it opens up all kinds of questions. When I first saw the beach painting, I didn't realise that it was sort of like a comic strip. There's a sequence. So that's the first one, and the riders are approaching the beach, and the other two riders, who seem spiritual sort of figures, are on the left. And in this one, the two on the white horses have moved to the right. We don't know what happens in between. And so my question about the whole field is that, is this a meeting, or is it just a crossing of paths? I will stop there. I don't want to read out a lot of acknowledgements, but since she's here, I just wanted to thank Annie, because she did a very detailed and penetrating critique of an earlier version of the book, and I'm sure it still has many faults and issues, but not as many as it did before.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm going to invite Elizabeth Charles up now to respond to the book and also to pose a couple of questions to Nick. And then the way that we will proceed is that Nicholas will respond back to Liz, and then we will move on to Maya and we'll have a kind of similar discussion, and then gradually we will open it up to a panel discussion and then to you. So by the end of it, everyone should have had a chance to ask some questions and discuss things. I hope that sounds okay. Thank you. Welcome.
Hello, it's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Nick for inviting me, and Ketty and Carolyn as well. It's a delight to be here, and this book is going to be discussed for a very long time. So it's a privilege to be here among one of the first discussions. And let me just start by saying, read it. It's really engaging, very well written. So my comments, we were asked to stay to just under 15 minutes so that we have time for questions. I want to start by just speaking as an art historian. That's who I am. And I have deepest respect for the other kinds of disciplines and areas of inquiry that many people here tonight bring to the topics. We art historians tend to think that we generally know Gauguin. Those large-scale exhibitions, starting with the first major retrospective in 1906 in Paris, they fueled a very lively interest over a century now. Blockbuster monographic exhibitions for the last 70 years, especially in Europe and America, showcase a solo Gauguin under any number of rubrics, as you know well, presenting the works chronologically, geographically, thematically, by media, on canvas, pastels, drawings, prints, monotypes carved in wood and molded in ceramic. And he's featured in any number of comparative studies. Many of you will know the Van Gogh Gauguin exhibition, I think, from Chicago. Group shows surveying major themes such as Impressionism and Symbolism, which you also know well. We also know him more than most artists of this moment, except perhaps for Van Gogh, through his writings. The voluminous letters, statements, essays, treatises, manuscripts intended for French publication, which of course include the Avant et Après, and also the Raconteur de Rapin, which amazingly are now, thankfully, here at the Courtauld. So this is an interesting moment to think about that as well. And we also think we know Gauguin through that notorious peripatetic life, those key events, which has caught popular attention, not just in recent times. And the literary accounts, as Nick notes, go back to years just after his death. And I would cite first Victor Ségolène, Gauguin dans son dernier discours, 1904, just a year after his death. Or the novel very loosely inspired by Gauguin's life, which Nick actually calls a woefully crude version of the Gauguin myth. I think that's well said. The Moon and the Sixpence of 1919. But also cinema has had its impact, especially since the 1956 swaggering embodiment of Gauguin by Anthony Quinn, starring as the abrasive and restless friend to Van Gogh in Manelli's Lust for Life. But we are recipients of serious scholarship, and we're grateful for the significant biography-based study by anthropologist, journalist Bengt Danielsen. Danielsen has also had his broad impact, but we've all benefited from the ambitious scholarly work in the last 40 years on Gauguin's Polynesian career. And here, I emphasize this is a partial list. We have time limits here, but I note Dick Field, Ziva Mazels, Ruth Bertel, Charlie Stuckey, Jehan Tillett-Fisk, Abigail Solomon Godot, Griselda Pollock, George Shackelford, Belinda Thomas, Linda Goddard, Gloria Groom, Stephen Eisenman, Chris Riopel, Connie Homburg, Harriet Stratus, June Hargrove, Star Figura, Caroline Boyle-Turner, etc. And that's a super brief list, and I've limited it really to the English and American authors. We could go much further, of course. These voices have all woven what we know, or what we think we know, of Gauguin's life as lived in Polynesia, into a broad-ranging critical assessment of the art, its value, and its impact. But now, through the deep expertise in Pacific histories and cultures, and some lived experience, moving between the islands, as he writes about, and living in the Marquesas, Nicholas Thomas offers us in this book fresh perspectives on episodes of what we thought were the well-known connections of Gauguin with his family, fellow French travelers, Polynesian young women, I agree, young adults, with colonial residents, with the island authorities and colonial institutions of his time. Nick asks us to step back and consider, with minds more curious than judgmental, the unfoldings of cross-cultural encounter for an artist living day-to-day in Polynesia. And Nick accepts that much of Gauguin, as in the meanings of Manautu Papau he referenced, cannot be made coherent and lie beyond resolution. And it's in part that ambiguity he helps us to come to terms with. We often think we know the breadth and significance of the art practice, how he made his art, in part due to the constructions of modernism inherited through decades. And here we go, sorting through, this will look familiar. That basic query, just what forms and techniques and themes and ideas were crucial to the cutting-edge art of the avant-garde at the close of the 19th century. This story was built throughout the 20th century in part by critics, collectors, curators, and of course, behind the scenes and deeply powerful dealer collectives. I have to mention curator critic Roger Fry, much studied work at the Grafton Galleries in 1910, and I credit all that we've learned from Anna Grunstner-Robbins. So Gauguin has long been known in England. Thanks also to Alfred Barr, the first director at MoMA in New York, and curator of its first show in 1929 that promoted Gauguin's place in modernism. And to the influential work, of course, of John Rewald, author of that great heavy tome Post-Impressionism 1956. With all this, Gauguin became a firm cornerstone of that classic quartet of star male modernists, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Seurat, and Gauguin. So his place was further embedded along the way through a century of global exhibitions, characterized by media buildup, jammed galleries, expensive tickets, and the now familiar merchandising campaigns, but those aren't new. I would point out that souvenir postcards of Gauguin were sold as early as 1913 at the Armory Show. Blockbusterism can be argued to start with the centenary of the artist's birth in 1949, with a substantial show at the Art Institute, Chicago, and the New York Met. Gauguin mania was fed by major shows in capitals such as Paris in 1949, the Tate at Edinburgh in 1955, Tokyo at the famed Seibu department store of 1969, and then all crowned by the Chicago, Washington, Paris, be-all, end-all, see-it-all now, sprawling exhibition of 1988. So decades of ambitious shows have only followed. One of the best was here in 2019, when Ottawa and London hosted the focused and elegant Gauguin portraits. I hope you saw it. And after the COVID shutdowns of 2020 and 2022, Gauguin retrospectives have, in spite of the debates, popped up again on the museum circuits. In Brazil, coming this summer, in Canberra and Houston, Vienna next fall, and Budapest after that. So on it goes, it hasn't stopped. So in spite of Council Gauguin waves, which have been sincere and powerful, due to the foregrounding of the artist's many uses and abuses of colonial privilege, his place may be controversial, and a few works may actually circulate out of view and go into storage, but the overall work is still central to the narratives of Euro-modernism, as presented in the major museums of America, Europe, and beyond. Conversations about the meanings of his art continue globally, in part due to the significant stashes of work in Australia, Israel, they were publishing essays on Gauguin in early November last year, which is amazing. Scandinavia, Japan, Cater, and more. But what are the collections of Gauguin's work in Polynesia itself, source of those key subjects? Such collections there are thin, to put it mildly. There are a few notable paintings and prints in Honolulu in New Zealand, only a very few prints, including the less valued Paula Gauguin prints, and a few minor wooden sculptures, those spoons and menu designs, that landed in a museum in Tahiti. And a few Gauguin works in private collections occasionally float out of Polynesia and land in the New York and Paris auction art world, but those are few. Make no mistake, there have been only 3 public exhibitions of Gauguin's art in Tahiti. 2 didactic heavy ones at the now closed Musée Gauguin in 1968 and 79, and one with major French Gauguin loans, really interesting, important pictures, coming to Tahiti only for the first time in 2003. An effort supported by none less than Jacques Chirac and curated by a team including an Orsay curator, Claire Fresh-Torry. This effort depended on colonizing the state-of-the-art climatized galleries at the Musée Tahiti des Îles de Te Whare and Manaha, taking over space built to showcase precious historic objects of Pacific Islander cultures. And without that space, the French-endorsed managed show would not have happened. So in general, the limited presence of original works by Gauguin in Polynesia is evidence for us of the sheer economic, logistical, and infrastructural power of the art audience. That is, those for whom Gauguin thought he was painting, and especially in later years, for whom he was writing. A lot of art history energy has gone into how he aspired, connived, connected, and labored to get his work back to that French audience. That audience whose patronage he sought desperately. So how did his images connect with the concerns of Impressionism and symbolism, the artists of his time? What were his contributions to the questions that were debated in Paris? Those are the questions art historians often generally pursue, focusing on subjects, inspiration, aesthetic, invention, collaboration, and impact in our history of modern art. But for all that,
Gauguin ceded to the power of the imagination, of idea over materiality, of the spiritual that he sought to invoke. He was, of course, not making an abstract art. His ideas and subjects, and even his art materials, were often grounded in what he saw, heard, read, or took physically from his environment. He didn't just make it all up. The works done in Polynesia are obviously full of real people, real faces, of place, tropical nature, its images, materials, complex social circumstances, cultural tradition and ruptures, and the intersection of all of them. And while making art in Tahiti and the Marquesas, as Nick has shown us, Gauguin's constantly registering his own particular encounters with that world from a perspective shaped not just by a compelling place, and also by his previous travels, his Catholic education, the values of an art world in Paris, and by the artistic priorities of his circle. He was lured to Polynesia by what for him only was novel, fascinating, puzzling, beyond easy understanding and explanation. What Nick reveals to us in thought-provoking detail is both how disoriented and yet also how profoundly moved Gauguin was in his direct encounters with a modern Polynesian culture that was certainly not dying, and by his attempts to render an art in a vibrant world in which he was but a transient, impoverished, and marginal participant. So I've got two questions for Nick. There could be hours of them, but I do want to say I think this is a book that only Nicholas Thomas could have written. My first question is, when in search of a more Polynesian-centered understanding of Gauguin, how did you, as author and researcher, deal with the uneven, biased archives? What's left, what isn't? And we've had some clear sources many of us have referred to through the years. That includes the art itself, obviously, all that goes with that. We also know a rich photographic record of the colonial period in the Marquesas, seen through the eyes of colonial photographers, Spitz, Lemasson, Augustini, and others. We know diaries of some elite European visitors, like Lady Brassey and Robert Louis Stevenson, studied by some in this room. We can use all of these profitably as a comparative material to build a kind of context of a colonial and at times touristic mindset. Nick very cleverly separates Gauguin out from tourism. He describes him as a settler. We also have government records that we can look at, and Danielson has done that, all kinds of records. But when we turn to the Polynesian voice, we still have a few indigenous voices from that moment. The Tiva clan, Tati Salmo and Papa Ra, Queen Arai Tamai, Marau's mother, and her memoirs that were published by Henry Adams in 1901. And finally, we have a few precious first-hand recollections from those who knew Gauguin, and we can thank Ben Danielson for doing key interviews in the 1960s. But to help the reader of your book, what new windows onto the historical landscape have you, with your expertise, located or discovered or reinterpreted, things that we've missed? What have you seen that more Euro-centered art historians have missed just because we don't have the same experience? And then the next question has to do with Polynesia today, which is full of mediated Gauguin, who thrives in popular culture on towels and postcards and frame posters everywhere. Gauguin's name is borrowed by the very luxury cruise ship that brings tourists and jobs to the islands, but there are some high-profile contemporary indigenous resistors to that legacy of consumption. And that includes in particular Chantal Spitz, a poet and novelist, and who wrote an essay, Where Are We 100 Years After Paul Gauguin Asked the Question? And she, on the left, passionately condemns the presence of Gauguin in Tahiti in word and in image. And she begs the Maori people to just free themselves of all references to him. And yet, by contrast, some Pacific Islanders, like Samoan Japanese artist Yuki Kihara on the right, intentionally invoke the Gauguin legacy through parody and appropriation to turn the tables. For Kihara, Gauguin's imagery becomes a productive instrument to confront colonial legacies and to present today's vibrant whakawhine, or third gender, community to an international audience. So Nick, in thinking beyond these kind of internationally minded creative artists who are so important, I'm really keen to know what else you've heard kind of on a more day-to-day basis when Polynesians refer to Gauguin today. My own limited experience is that his art is certainly known through reproduction, but it's of limited interest. What is of concern is the wealth that people are making off his art outside of Polynesia. And I'm keen to know what plans you have to distribute this book to a Polynesian audience, maybe in translation. We're thankful there's a digital edition that can go easily across borders. How else can you give a global audience access to your exciting thinking? And in short, to paraphrase Gauguin, now that we know where your book has come from and what it is, Nick, where is it going?
Thanks so much, Liz, for that very rich contextualization and history, and for the the gracious comments and the rather challenging questions. I mean, I think I could talk at, I don't know quite where to sort of start and stop on the method side of it. I think with any kind of cross-cultural history, I mean, one just has to try and engage with everything that's salient or documented to try and put a picture together, and one gets things rather fortuitously from very different angles and contexts. But I think, I do think in a way that there is an awful lot in the Gauguin work that has been under-examined, because so much attention has been focused on a relatively small number of works, which many of us have sort of, I guess understandably, dedicated whole chapters to in different books, and the other couple of hundred paintings from Tahiti, and sketches and works on paper, and what he called his sculptures that were ultra sauvage, aren't exactly sort of left out or undiscussed, but offer different things, you know, other stories and so on. And I think I can't say that I just had sort of this method and did it that way and that was illuminating, because in some contexts, I mean, one of the arguments of the book is in a way that even people who are critical of Gauguin pay too much attention to what he says about his own work. But I mean, there are contexts where what he says is obliquely illuminating. And much of what he writes about his own experience is in some ways pretty obviously made up when he had reasons to make certain things up. But there are also anecdotes that he didn't make up because there was no reason for him to make it up. And that's where, for example, I think we get real insight into a very extraordinary painting, the Wahine no Te Tiari in Copenhagen, and I'm sorry I haven't got a slide of it. But the anecdote that goes with that, or the part of it that seems, I think, nothing he would have made up, is where he asks her, can he paint the portrait, and she's a bit cross and goes away and then comes back later. I mean, my take on that is that she doesn't mind being represented, but she wants to present herself as she wants to be represented. And that kind of resonated for me because when I was in Nuku'hiva a couple of years ago, I'd sort of agreed to take a photo of a young woman who, as it happens, works in the library there. And she says, fine, but I've got to go and put on a clean T-shirt sort of thing. So, I mean, people are conscious of, I mean, Maya could speak about this with more authority than I am, but I think people in Polynesia are very conscious of appearance and dress and dignity and all of that sort of thing. So they want to control the circumstances in which they're being depicted. But that's a rather specific instance of a case where I think reading a very complex and indeed sort of semi-concocted text can tell us about things, elements that are actually behind the work. But clearly there are different issues that arise with different paintings. I think it's really important to raise the question about, what does the public in Tahiti, what does the public in the Marquesas make of this work? I think sometimes in these kinds of discussions, and especially if you're in a sort of museum sector thing, because in the museum context people talk about the community all the time. Community means people who aren't employed by the museum. Or sometimes they are now, actually. But of course, we take it for granted that, presumably in this room, there's a lot of different views of this artist. I mean, that's going to be equally true in Tahiti. And so you will get some people, possibly more commonly in the Marquesas, because people there are aware of tourist interest and they engage with tourists, and tourists are interested in the Gauguin Cultural Centre there, which includes these rather roughly painted copies of a whole sequence of about 150 Gauguin works. So many of them, I think, are somewhat more interested, and they do respond to contexts where they think islanders are being, presented sort of respectfully. But at the same time, you can meet somebody else around the corner who'll just say, pedophile. And that's sort of it. So these perspectives are just as heterogeneous as they would be anywhere else. But I think what you said as well is that in general, it's sort of striking actually that people in Tahiti are not particularly aware of Gauguin, and not particularly interested. And incidentally, they're not particularly aware of Bougainville or Captain Cook or any of that sort of history that looms large elsewhere. If you talk to a lot of people in Tahiti about history, they'll say, well, the London Missionary Society, when the missionaries arrived, that was what was really important to us. Of course, I do hope the book is in French at some point. It's also interesting that following the redevelopment of Te Whare I Manaha, the Musée de Tahiti et des Îles, considerations being given, in fact, by the tourism ministry rather than the culture ministry in French Polynesia to redevelop a Gauguin site or centre. And I suppose at some point I would hope to, offer them some perspectives that might be interesting, but whether that initiative will even be taken up by the new government there, I don't know. I'll leave it.
Yeah, no, we should Thank you very much, Nick. I'd like to invite Maya now to respond in her own way to the book, and also to pose a couple of questions to Nicholas. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou mō tō tautoko te kaupapa o te rāne e. Yes, so thank you to the Courtauld, thank you to Nick. Great to be on the panel with you, Liz. It's great to be back in London. So I'm Maya, and I look after the arts of Oceania at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where I moved 9 years ago. So I don't actually look after the collection of paintings or drawings and prints that are in the collection, and indeed ceramics. But I have a slightly different, in the museum, because we have a department of European paintings, we have a department of prints and drawings, So I have this kind of interesting relationship, I think, with the prints and drawings and works that are in the building, and have a slightly different entry point, in a sense, to using them to think through ways of understanding Gauguin's work. And as you said in the intro, a lot of that work is trying to pull back kind of cosmological understandings and indigenous perspectives from the work. So the last exhibition that was dedicated to Gauguin's works, actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was in 2002, so over 20 years ago now. And that was coinciding, it was called The Lure of the Exotic, and it was timed to coincide with the 90th anniversary of his death the following year in 2003. So what I found so engaging, in a sense, because that was, you know, I looked at the catalogue at that and I kind of engaged with that. But what I find so interesting about Nick's book is that when you're on this border with anthropology, ethnography, art history, and you're kind of using all the disciplinary tools to interpret works of art that are either from Oceania or have a relationship with it, it takes us to quite interesting places. And so really in the field we don't try to cordon ourselves off from kind of thinking in a very kind of holistic way about the art. And so what actually happens with what Nick's done, when you apply a cross-cultural lens to assess, interpret, and reflect upon the prolific range of works that Paul Gauguin produced during his lifetime, you know, how, you know, does that penetrate the work produced in Tahiti and the Marquesas Islands in a slightly different way? And so I really found this book refreshingly original, and what struck me was the way that the book guides you as a reader through this crisscrossing series. You kind of track to and fro through vignettes, which is very fascinating, but through the series of historical trajectories and personal encounters that Nick himself has had. So you have this kind of tracking across space and time that really take us across, you know, time and place. Yeah. So what Nick has done in this book is to deploy the paintings, the people, and places that Gauguin engaged with as sites of connection. And that's really useful because it really returns us to the landscape, and more importantly, the powerful agency of the islands that's really so tangible for those of us who have the privilege to visit there and spend time there. And it's that spiritual and cosmological landscape of the islands that I think really come to the fore only several months after Gauguin himself arrives to Tahiti for the first time in 1891. And I start with my kind of thinking through this in response to Nick's book with this painting, Ari'i Matamoi, which is a rather provocative painting that is now at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. So Ari'i Matamoi, or La Fin Royale, or The Royal End, which was painted in 1892, a year, or the following year, a few months after Gauguin arrives, and may be based on the funeral of the Tahitian king, Pomare, or the chief, sorry, Pomare V. So Ari'i meaning a chief or noble person, and Matamoi means sleep, moi, and I is mata. So in terms of Matamoi, he's gone, passed on, or dead. And it shows the head of Pomare V presented on folds of cushion or lengths of bark cloth or tapa in the interior of a whare tupapa'u, a house in which the corpse of the chief would have laid in state during mourning rites. Isolated and severed from the body, which is not a usual treatment of the body in a funerary context in Polynesia. And it's presented on what's a large bowl, usually intended for food, umete, which is shocking in its insinuation of kind of specific protocols, in a sense, to have something that's tapu and sacred in a food, container. So he's kind of being presented or served up on a platter as if for a banquet or feast. In the background, we see mourners and the carved architectural elements of houseboats and tiki figures which adorn and embellish the house in which the head lies in state. So this has really been taken as a metaphor for the disillusionment that Gauguin feels on his arrival in Tahiti. And the king's death for the artist becomes emblematic of the death of traditional Tahitian culture as a whole in the face of European civilization and French colonization. And he writes, with him disappeared the last vestiges of the ancient ways and grandeur. With him, Maori tradition has died. It is truly finished civilization, alas. But the traces of this so distant and mysterious past, insofar as they still subsisted, how to discover them alone, without guidance, without any support, to rediscover this extinguished hearth, to rekindle the fire in the midst of all this ashes. So I just cite that because we know Gauguin's kind of really looking for a way to kind of penetrate those ancient ways. He's inserted himself into this landscape with an objective to do that. So according to Scott Allen on the J. Paul Getty Museum website for this label, he writes that the painting really presents a funerary rite translated back into an imagined pre-colonial Maori idiom and infused with the nobility and gravity that Gauguin associated with the Tahiti of the distant past. We know that Gauguin was also stimulated by his reading of secondary sources like Jacques-Antoine's Morinhu's Voyage aux îles du Grand Océan, and that writing includes information about mortuary cults, including decorated skulls, propitiatory sacrifices. So I just wanted to start with that because it's a kind of way in, I think, for reminding us, what Gauguin's trying to do. That's his project when he arrives. But what's really interesting, I think that I found so engaging in trying to kind of come to terms with Gauguin's entry point into all this history is, and I'll show a selection of these woodblock prints that are in the Met's collection, which Gauguin worked on between December 1893 and March 1894, and they were intended as illustrations to illustrate Noa Noa, or fragrant salt, that scent, that manuscript that he was developing in Paris about his recent 2-year residency in Tahiti. And these prints have become a focus of interest in recent years, and they were featured in 2 wonderful exhibitions in the United States in this past decade. So Metamorphosis at MoMA in 2014 had a show which focused exclusively on them, and Gauguin's Paradise Remembered, the Noa Noa prints, which was at Princeton Art University, at the Museum of Art on the university campus there, curated by Calvin Brown and Alistair Wright, St John's College, Oxford. And the woodblock on the left of this slide was produced for the title print of Noa Noa's suite. And the block itself consists of 9 sections of fruitwood, probably pear, joined together and sprung along horizontal joinings, and really gives an extraordinary amount of information about Gauguin's working methods as it reveals the hand of the artist in every kind of gorged mark, incised line and jagged hollow. And Erica Mossier, in her excellent essay in the catalogue for the MoMA show, writes that the woodcut suite for Noa Noa are the most innovative of his works on paper, and also the most complicated and difficult to decipher. Indeed, as she points out, although the Noa Noa works are now fairly well known as prints, they are highly unconventional as such. And Gauguin printed each of the 10 compositions multiple times and in various colours, using distinctive techniques geared more towards experimentation than towards producing numerous identical copies. And so many of these multiples are actually in the Met's collection. Show you. So we have, 2 different ones here that I've just kind of honed in on, but they are on our website, and they're very interesting to kind of juxtapose the different versions of the same woodblock, so you can see the kind of experimentation that he's engaged in. The Noa Noa woodcuts, as we know, were seen for the first time by a coterie of Gauguin's friends and admirers at the artist's Paris studio exhibition in December 1894. And the two art critics who attended, Julien Leclerc and Charles Maurice, in fact, who co-authored the Noa Noa manuscript with Gauguin, praised the crudely carved woodcuts as a revolution in the art of printmaking, and recognized them as a bridge between the seemingly disparate qualities of Gauguin's paintings and sculpture. And I think they give us, or they help us glimpse and understand a novel response to philosophical questions that may have preoccupied Gauguin and were clearly evolving over time as he spent longer periods in the islands. It's interesting to consider that in the complicated production of this suite of prints, Gauguin may have found a medium which allowed him to begin to penetrate in a more nuanced way the ancestral landscape which he wanted to immerse himself in, and indeed, has kind of pushed himself into this uncomfortable or outsider position on a threshold in this kind of liminal space, a threshold of in-betweenness which he's navigating. So from the lens of my own research interests, these prints say a lot to me in terms of their relationship to apparently eclipsed aspects of Polynesian cosmology. And I've become interested in exploring the extent to which Gauguin, having grappled with the task of penetrating the mysteries of a strange, rather alien culture, might in fact have started to absorb much of the very distinctive way that Polynesian people look at the world, at the boundaries of space and time, relationship with the afterlife, and his own people's relationship with the ancestors. And this print, in particular, L'univers est créé, the universe created, is one of the series that he intended would illustrate Noa Noa. It's a really dark, raw image that gives us far deeper insights into the extent of immersion into Polynesian spiritual life that Gauguin so desperately sought. For me, it captures a time when the universe was erupting into consciousness, primordial waters overflow, releasing prehistoric fish, ancient rock, and sprouting vegetation. You can see these sketched skeletal forms and amphibian teeth, which join the veiled presence of ancestral spirits, observing from shadowy recesses as elemental light pierces through the barrier of night and vegetal human life begins to coalesce. Normal boundaries are apparently eclipsed in this generative landscape of tupu noa. Tupu noa meaning spontaneous and free-flowing growth, so that the figure of a woman newly emerging from a churning ocean, literally teeming with burgeoning life, draws breath whilst wringing her hair out on the beach. Here's another version of it, where you get that red coming through, red being a very tapu or sacred colour in Polynesia. But when viewed from the lens of Polynesian understanding of cosmology and creation, Gauguin's print gives me at least the strong impression that he's begun to really absorb some of the deeper philosophical meanings of the stories, ideas and legends that islanders would have been sharing with him, and or that he was reading in Jacques-Antoine Morinho's accounts, and trying to feed this imaginative leap that he's made. I think his channels are open, and my sense is that these prints kind of see that kind of landscape getting a bit more under his skin. This is a drawing by Paiore, which is quite a famous drawing by Paiore, a tohunga, really, a ritual specialist or expert who draws this image to explain a creation myth or story. So he uses this as a kind of schematic diagram to kind of help his interlocutor, who is a missionary, record this. And you can see here, so it's not really a literal relationship I want to make, but it's just useful, I think, for you to see that islanders really imagined the universe as a vast immensity which surrounded and enclosed them. And the creation myths throughout Polynesia really explain how the islands came to be through in terms of their beginning, through this very long dark night called Tipor. Tipor actually, a phrase that Gauguin writes into some of these prints, and in fact titles them as such. The universe is bathed in darkness which lasts many eons of time. It's a long, dark, all-engulfing night known as Tipor, and it's a realm associated with darkness and ancestors, gods and spirits. And the important thing is not conceived as a cold or empty void. It's a very vital and active space that really is understood to pulse with the force of regeneration. And its corresponding realm is a world of light and life, known as Theal, in which ordinary human endeavour takes place. So there's this notion of kind of extraordinary time in Tipor, and then a kind of ordinary daily life, which is Theal. So here, we can see the many layers of the sky, each with distinctive names and attributes. We see a clear representation of the genealogical relationship between gods, people, vegetation, the ocean, the marine environment. So all these various elements are linked in a chain of being, where there is no distinction between gods at the top of the chain on the outer spheres of that sky, with the men with whom they are linked, who you see depicted here via their raised arms and the environment. So the divine links to the earthly, which links to the animal, vegetable and mineral world. So these two complementary spheres are believed to operate in synergy. These are known as Theal, the world of light and life, and Tipor, as I said, which Gauguin actually gives as a title to one of the prints in the series. So in this image entitled Manau Tupapa'u, Spirit of the Dead Watching, we see the contours of a female body curled up, asleep, perhaps, encircled in a canopy of light, and she appears to be kind of surrounded, encircled from that surrounding darkness. And I don't mean to make this a literal transition, but it's just interesting to see that Tiki figure in the top right-hand corner. And there's certainly, for me at least, this kind of this separation that's happening and that kind of understanding of a landscape. The night here seems to signal ancestral time. The spirits of ancestors expressed in the form of statues watch on from the beyond. Time has that kind of elemental, eternal kind of quality. Ancient time fusing with the now, the past becoming coeval in the present, which is really a very current way to think in specific terms of time. And prior to evangelization by Christian missionaries, understandings of this day versus night complementary realms was not infused with ideas of good or evil. These are simply boundaries that separate two complementary states of being. And it's only later, really, following the teachings of Christianity by missionaries in the field, and indeed London Missionary Society arrived to Tahiti in 1797 on James Wilson's vessel from London. It's only really then that the night is associated as being dangerous or deadly, where evil devil-like creatures may dwell. And missionaries even built upon these kinds of ideas with the rhetoric of light overcoming darkness, of the gospel that had a natural synergy with the Polynesian framework of the relationships between light and dark, night and day. So what I didn't include in these images was another kind of set of them which has that lizards and birds, birds are messengers of the gods of the Atua or the spirit realm. Birds often clutching lizards or mo'o. Mo'o are guardians who inhabit portals on thresholds. Sometimes, they're often actually gendered as female. Dark places, watery realms, the kind of interiors of caves where, that would be an access point from Teao into Tipor, and these start to crop up in some of these images. So it may be that they're not relevant, but I just imagine that the people he's engaging with are pointing out the significance of birds to the culture, because it happens all the time. If birds come down and start just standing near you in the Pacific, people will point out a note and you'll kind of have that conversation about, is that bird look? And so I just imagine that he was being exposed to these, what are very normal understandings of daily life. So to my mind, something really switches in these prints, and the cosmological atmosphere of the island kind of seems to have seeped into his being. The tangible presence of ancestors seems to become concrete. He appears to kind of understand this relationship in which the past periodically inhabits the present. So my question of Nick really is, given that, when you're in there is that agency of the land. I think you touched on it in the book. And I wondered, what for you is the extent of Gauguin's articulation with that kind of spiritual agency of the land and place in Tahiti and the Marquesas? How central to his objectives and how successful do you think that he may have been in kind of navigating these boundaries? Do you want to be, shall I say the second one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second question is really to take up that moment of modernity that you talk about in that chapter where you talk about his journey returning to Tahiti for the second time, and when he stops off in Auckland and is actually exposed to the Sir George Grey collection at Auckland Museum, and there's that fantastic black and white double spread image that you have in the book of that installation circa 1893. And so I've heard you, talk about this, this very important idea that you really then have unpacked for me, and for us as readers in the book, of this juxtaposition of Maori modernists like Wero Patoramu, and indeed you make a connection with Tene Waitere, who is the Maori carver, Tarawai carver, who actually, if you know Hinemihi at Clarendon House, is a whanenui or Maori meeting house that he carved. And what the point you make is that these Maori carvers were navigating both worlds in this very kind of tremendous moment in community by, responding to commissions, tribal commissions for the iwi to build, architectural features to go in, ancestral meeting houses that are, being used in the region, but also they're making tobacco boxes, the toko or walking stick that you illustrate in the book, and indeed, pipes. So they're making, they're navigating that world just as Paul Gauguin is. And I just think I'd love to hear you unpack that a bit more and just have us understand that very important idea about, how these two interact. And why is it so difficult in a way for us to think of them as the same? Paul Gauguin in his avant-garde moment that you opened up for us so beautifully, Liz, and someone like Wero or Patoramu in New Zealand who are doing the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maya, thanks. I think those comments were incredibly rich, especially about L'Univers Créé and the other Noa prints. I mean, I can sort of see that there's just a lot more that could be said about those works. And it's also surprising, given how much has been done about Gauguin, that I certainly keep thinking that there's a lot more that could be said. I find that the question about the extent, did he really grasp, the spirituality of the landscape or specific expressions of atua, of spirits, quite difficult to calculate or think through. But since we're sort of at the courthole, I mean, it's worth just remembering, Nevermore, which of course has the bird, and one of the sort of helpful characteristic comments that Gauguin makes about this is that it is not the Raven of Poe, when, given that the title of the painting is Nevermore, you think, well, surely it is. But, I mean, maybe he is thinking of other resonances that birds could have in that context. Maybe I can answer that question a little bit laterally as well, because it strikes me, I think one of the things that I found really extraordinary as I worked through what he did during his first period in Tahiti, 1891 and 92, is that there were works where he does things that are completely unprecedented in Western painting, like the Parahi Te Marae, you know, here is the marae, here is the temple precinct, which has this hill and a big statue figure that doesn't look anything like what you would see on a Tahitian marae, and it's not the right geography or anything like that. What he's done in the foreground is constitute this fence, which is a sort of radical enlargement of a Marquesan ornament that is about 2.5 centimeters long and has a very complex kind of sort of quadrilateral involuted carving form. So he's done that. He's extracted this tiny motif and turned it into part of the architecture of this painting. Well, it's a remarkable work in itself, but I think what's most remarkable is that he sort of only does it once. I mean, you would think if we're used to thinking about artists' projects, like, you know, Chardin's still lifes or something like that, I mean, the project is 40 paintings or 10 or something like that. And so many of his contemporaries had projects that were realized over many years through many reworkings of comparable motifs and sort of stylistic kind of challenges. And this work is also, I don't know, just painted after or before Orana Maria, the so-called Hail Mary painting. And that's also the only time he does that. So it's like in Gauguin, the painting is the whole project. I mean, he does this kind of thing and then goes on to do something completely different. And I think all of this makes that question more complicated. It's a very fundamental question, but it sort of depends where you look. I think it is really important to insist that there was a lot of modern art in the Pacific that was made by Pacific Islanders in the 1880s and 90s, and Gauguin was only one of a number of people who were doing unprecedented things, things that were unprecedented in their own contexts, work that happened because they were engaged cross-culturally in some way and wouldn't have happened otherwise. And it's the Maori sculptors who started doing a whole range of different things and did things that were conceptually different because they produced sort of narrative kind of work rather than embodiment kind of work, as well as work on different scales for different destinations and so on. I mean, that is very important, but there are also, you know, the Niuean bark cloth painters who I mention in the book, and many other genres at that time are new. But I think I was intrigued partly by the sort of coincidence of the affinity between some of the things that Gauguin did and some of the things these Maori sculptors did at the same time. Or for that matter, sculptors in the Marquesas who, a generation or so earlier, were basically carving undecorated bowls for food, but then started decorating these bowls because then they were saleable to outsiders. When Gauguin made some of his first sculptures in Polynesia, he was having real trouble selling works, and he actually sold some of those pieces to local Europeans who wanted them because they also bought curios from islanders. So that, in a sense, the sort of a kind of disciplinary divide that people would take for granted, that one lot of this stuff was sort of novel forms of indigenous art, and the other was an expression of an avant-garde, collapsed at that very moment. And it also collapses in another way. I mean, there's a very impressive and intriguing umete, a big food dish, which is in the Orsay, which is actually a vessel that was probably sculpted by a Marquesan. It was in Tahiti, but then had surface decoration by Gauguin. And he painted this vessel in the one with the 3 children, although the decoration he put on it is not in the painting, the vessel itself is. It seems as if he made another dish like that, which has disappeared. And if it hasn't been destroyed, it's probably been mistaken for an ethnographic object and it's in the stores of some museum. So I think these, and that's in a sense as it should be, but it would be nice to exhibit them together rather than keep them apart.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Liz and Maya and Nick for those responses and questions. Over to you. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Nick or Maya or Liz, but especially Nick about Nick?
I'm just curious about the first painting that Maya showed.
There's a microphone just coming to you actually. Do you want to just say it in that? Thank you. Which one is it? Should I do something with this? Handheld mic. Is that any better?
Yeah. So, just curious about the photo, the painting that you said. I'm assuming that it wasn't that it wasn't a posed setup. That was he was allowed into the room to paint the thing as it the scene as it was during that moment.
Well, what we do know is that
So just because it seems quite curious that that was an unusual.
Well, the serving up of the severed, yeah. But I mean, we do know, and you talk about it as well in the book, which when I read it was reminded of, is that Gauguin's actually invited, isn't he, to attend those funeral rites and ceremonies with that once the Paul Murray has passed, and indeed to decorate the Whare Tupapa'u and that area where they're gathering, and he kind of defers to the local
Morale.
Yeah, to Morale. So I'll let you talk about that. Yeah.
Widow.
But so he's definitely in those areas, and in those ceremonial gatherings, and you hooked up to Whare Himene, which are the kind of evening. He was listening, I think, to those. That was a different occasion, but he's definitely listening to those, the morning ceremonies that last several days, and everyone's sleeping in the whare with the tupapa'u. So he's, I think, adapting what he's seen, to create that in his own way. I'll let you talk about that.
I mean, the image itself is a complete concoction in the sense that Murray was not, did not have his head severed, and the style of the rooms was essentially those of, a colonial palace. So he's sort of getting at something, but it's not anything to do with what he witnessed.
Yeah, it's really kind of the death of. It's not that, it's held up as that kind of moment of disillusionment, isn't it? And his arrival, and he's like, oh, this is the last in the line of Tahitian Ari'i. It's finished with Paul Murray V. He's the last one, and this is it. It's gone. And so he's kind of examining that, I think.
Right. But it's also a confection when you get into it. The rug is probably Persian. I mean, he's just mixing all kinds of things up. And it's just essential to say his approach is never documentary. So he could attend an event, hear something about an event, and then reinvent it, drawing in a kind of, conglomerate, which is his method. So I could imagine him being
inspired by what was a very formal procession and the observation of Pomari's death, but then spinning out from it and borrowing, and I can't remember who does the publish it, but the possibility that from other islands a severed shrunken head could have come, that he might have seen as a kind of trade object in a Spitz curio store. Certainly nothing he saw there.
No, but I always think about Salome
Yeah, well, of course.
when I see
Of
that.
course.
So, that's the other
Couldn't agree
angle,
more.
that he's kind of bringing in, of course, his relationship to that. So that's something
Salome and the severed head.
to unpack. So it's all in there.
And they can be there together. I think
Yeah.
that's the important thing that that we really see as we go through your book, is how you don't fight to put it in a category, but you allow things to have this multiplicity of reference, which I think is appropriate to him as an artist and appropriate to Haiti's modern place. And that's, I think, the real, one of the many, many contributions is allowing us to have both that, it's not even just ambiguity, it's multiplicity of voices and references, which he's then able to leave, in your word, unresolved. And thank you, yes. We can't pin them all down.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, one up here.
Just like going on from what you just said, were his works ever seen as being representative? Were they ever kind of understood in that sense? I know that we don't understand them as that now, but at the time, were they kind of seen in Europe or whatever, were they circulated, were they seen as being representative of Latin Polynesia?
Oh, yeah, that's yours.
Did Europeans think
There's
that they would?
There's a wonderful dissertation done under T.J. Clark by Karen Eslianis that examines the responses from the 1893 Durand-Ruel show. And it's vast, and yes, it's taken by many casual viewers as real, right?
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting. Any other? Yes, Belinda.
But surely I would argue that there's another more perhaps informed critical response which says that Gauguin is inventing Tahiti. I think very quickly critics of the symbolist the body of criticism that emerges, I seem to remember, does tax him with not being documentary and being very imaginative in his response.
That's also a symbolist response in that.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right, and I suppose I was very struck by a review that I quote from a radical paper called L'Escarmouche, where he says, we like the portraits, we like the landscapes, these mythical scenes are ridiculous. And the last bit of this little review is, how about a real Tahitian painter? Can't we see some of that sort of thing? So it is interesting that, some of this critique, and also Thade Nathanson, who was very prominent as a writer who was sort of advocating Cézanne and so on, was very disparaging about Gauguin, in a more sort of polite, reasoned way, but actually quite devastating on exactly these grounds.
Thank you. I had a question actually. One of the most useful parts of the book for me, and I think it is incredibly important to have it there, is the section at the start where you explain Polynesian pronunciation. And I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about that, as to why it is important for us to understand how to pronounce the language.
Well, I think in a way this sort of goes back to what Maya was talking about, because Gauguin uses as is very well known, has all these Tahitian titles. His Tahitian is sort of notoriously scrambled. There's arguments, some people have argued that it was actually a bit better some of the time than is sometimes said. I was intrigued in relation to the, notorious Mana'o Tupapa'u, that in the title that's inscribed on the canvas, he's got these funny accents, which are actually attempts to get the glottal stops in there. So the first word you don't pronounce as though it's a diphthong like manao, it is manao. And the second one, tupapa'u, there is a stop, and a glottal stop means like a lost consonant, like ba'a, or something like that in Cockney. So there's a glottal stop before the U, and some of his the carvings he did around the same time are captioned T-double-I, and that word is the same as tiki in Marquesan or Maori. You call a representation of a god a tiki. In Tahiti they don't have the K, so it's a T. But with all of these terms, I mean, he was, making efforts to create these equivalences or translations or appropriate those idioms.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, George going to end shortly, but is there anything final that you would like to ask? Well, maybe we should carry on over a glass of wine in that case. In which case, we will go along to the research forum, which is just almost next door that way. But let's thank all of our speakers one last time. Thank you.